O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy...
Welcome to the King's Hand in History podcast. I'm Chris Van Duzen.
And I'm Casey Hoost, and we're here to proclaim the King's glorious deeds.
On this episode, we are talking about Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon in the Old Testament, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, so-called, as Daniel described him. And we're going to look at the precursors to the Babylonian Empire. We're going to look at its rise. We're going to look at the rise of Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to talk about his character, what kind of man he was, and then his fall and the end of his reign. Nebuchadnezzar plays a huge role in the Old Testament as he was brought about by God to bring judgment upon the Jews, upon Judah, and he destroyed Jerusalem. And also he serves as an example of God's sovereignty over the kings of the earth. And I think also that we see a pretty big parallel between Nebuchadnezzar and Donald Trump, possibly. We're gonna discuss his character because Nebuchadnezzar, although he was a wicked king, he did come to recognize the true God as the ruler of all things, and so he had a crisis moment of humility where he might have been converted. I guess we'll discuss that later on in this episode. But to start off, Casey is going to be mostly our guide today, looking at the historical aspects from sources outside of the Bible for Nebuchadnezzar. First of all, we're going to talk about the roots of the city of Babylon, starting with Babel itself, actually, I believe, right? Babel was Babel in the Old Testament in Genesis. It was the precursor, or it was actually where Babylon, the city, was later founded, right?
Yeah, that's debated, but either close
that.
to it. It says in Genesis, I think it's the plains of Shinar.
Right.
But yeah, so you get right in Genesis, Nimrod, who I think is the great grandson of Noah. It says he becomes a mighty hunter before the Lord, and there's a whole bunch of different interpretation of what that means. But basically, he seems to have become this king in the area of Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers. He sets up the city of Nineveh, so that'd be eventually the capital of Assyria, which is kind of the northern part of Mesopotamia, and Babylon is the southern part before they expand. And so you get the Tower of Babel being built, and most of you probably know the story of how they try to build a tower up to heavens because they think they can do anything, and the Lord says, let us go down and see, and confuses the language. And actually, Babel, that's one of the meanings of it, is confusion. Mm-hmm. And so the Lord confuses the languages, and the people are dispersed. But as far as Nimrod goes, he supposedly can, and when I say supposedly, when you get that far back, we're talking at least 2000 BC. There's not a lot of sources for it. There's myths that have hung around, but supposedly he forms this kingdom, and you have anywhere from everybody in the whole world, who at that time wouldn't be that many people, to just a group where he is the king, and he has this empire. He becomes still recognized by some as this god, like recognized as a sun god. A lot of people derive a lot of the pagan deities that spread throughout the world to him, to his son, who I forget what his name was, his wife, who I think was also his sister or his mother or something. Yeah. But I mean, think again though, at the time there's not many generations, and that
isn't that 2000 BC you said?
Yeah. I mean, think.
Well, that's like 4,000 years after the beginning.
But Noah with the bottleneck of people.
Okay,
so
gotcha.
there's not that many people around. Anyway, so whichever way you view Nimrod, there is, in Mesopotamia, there are empires arising. You get the Akkadian Empire, which really reigns from a little bit before 2000 BC. The Babylonian Empire does come to prominence for a few centuries, around like 19th to 16th century BC. If you remember Hammurabi and his code, he was one of the kings of Babylon. And then after that, going forward, Assyria slowly starts to rise, and they really last until the late 7th century BC. So as far as thinking biblical times, they are the dominant force in the area. If you know the story of Jonah, it was about, they say, 785 that he would have gone to Nineveh, and with the message that God's going to destroy you. And then Nineveh repented and lasted for another 180 years. It was 720 BC that Assyria conquered Israel. So not Judah, but the northern kingdom of Israel. They conquer them, and Israel is no longer. And then it's not until, and they do come, I think it's, I forget which year. I want to throw out something around 700, but maybe a little after that they do come to Jerusalem and siege it, and the Jerusalem miraculously survives. And so then they hold on, and so now we get to Nebuchadnezzar with the Babylonians. Is in the mid 600s, down in the southern part of Assyria, in the southern part of Mesopotamia, you have a rebellion led by Nabopolassar.
That was 597 BC.
No, that's the one with Nebuchadnezzar.
Oh, okay. Okay, never mind that.
And so Nabopolassar is Nebuchadnezzar's father, and he becomes the first king of Babylon, and Babylon starts to expand, and Nebuchadnezzar is his young general that goes around and fights for him. And they say that Nabopolassar was probably involved in politics, maybe a governor, a son of a governor, but had connections, and obviously the rebellion gains ground quickly, so that the whole southern part is a force. Now, southern part of Mesopotamia is a force, and you get Assyria and Egypt are now allying themselves together to try to curb this force. And so around this time, you have Judah is still its own independent state. You if you can picture Mesopotamia is east of Judah. You have Babylon
way east.
Yeah, but
Hundreds of miles east.
It is, but then Assyria though has expanded,
right? So
that it is near, Assyria's borders are near Judah or on Judah.
Yeah. North and northeast.
Yeah, and then so you have Babylon fighting Assyria, then you have Egypt on the other side of Judah, who is supporting Assyria, and you also have Egypt. There are several of these little countries like Judah, Lebanon, Moab, Ammon, maybe Edom. I don't remember at that point. And Egypt likes these little countries there. That's why they're still there. That they're buffer states. That if anybody happens to break through and come over, they have to go through and conquer each of these individually. It protects Egypt. Mm-hmm. So, but then in 608, Nebuchadnezzar takes down Assyria, and basically it's gone. Now it's Babylon, and Assyria is over. And so around this time, Egypt keeps coming over to fight the Babylonians, to fight Nebuchadnezzar. And I think they say probably 609, Necho on his trip, Necho being the pharaoh of Egypt, you might recognize this name. He's going over to fight Nebuchadnezzar, and King Josiah goes out to meet him. And King
Josiah was a righteous king. He had reforms, made reforms. He removed idolatry. Yeah. And restored the temple services. Yeah, and it's kind of like the last. When you're reading the Bible, it's like the last revival. Yeah, the last breath almost goes out of Judah when he dies. Right. And Necho, he goes out to meet Necho, and Necho basically says, like, "What are you doing? Like, I'm supposed to go fight." But Josiah wants to fight him, and he gets killed. Right. And so anyway, Necho goes on to fight Nebuchadnezzar, and he does over the next few years. And in 605, there's a major victory for Nebuchadnezzar. Carchemish. And this basically makes it so that all of the Near East
Egypt backs off. Egypt retreats back into Egypt, and now it's like all these little buffer states. If Babylon wants to go through them, that's up to them.
Right.
And so also in 605, Nebuchadnezzar's father dies. And so now Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon, and he reigns for 43 years, which is a very long time at that point.
Now, comparatively to other kings, you're saying? Or
Yes,
for Babylonian kings?
No, for comparatively, I mean, if you think about the death rate that kings are fighting, that if you get somebody that lasts for 30 or 40 years, that's a long time, and that's usually stability.
Right. Clearly he had tons of power, and they recognized his authority.
Yeah, though not at first. I guess the transfer of power was fine, but then he did deal with rebellions for the first decade or two of his reign, and so right after he becomes king, he had to go back east to Babylon to be crowned. Then he comes right back west. When I say west, I mean back towards where Israel, Judah would be, and he starts going through these small kingdoms because Egypt is backed off. So now if he wants to take them, he can. And he starts going through them, and in 597, he defeats Jerusalem, but he doesn't destroy it. Sets up Zedekiah as king,
who was originally called Mattaniah.
Okay.
And Nebuchadnezzar renames him Zedekiah.
Yeah.
And I forgot what Zedekiah means, but it means something different, obviously.
And they have actually found in there's a bunch of Babylonian tablets that as they dig stuff up, they find them. They have found references to Zedekiah being set up as king in Judah, so that's kind of cool. And so he sets him up, and then he goes back east after another year or two of war there, because he's starting to have rebellions in the east. He's been gone in the west for quite a while, so he goes east, and now Necho, the pharaoh of Egypt, dies.
So where exactly east did he go? Is that near modern day Iran?
Yeah, I think it's more back to like his home, like near Mesopotamia, maybe a little east east of that. Gotcha. So yeah, Iran, maybe a little bit further east. I'm not sure how far over their kingdom stretched.
Okay.
And so once Necho, the pharaoh of Egypt, dies, the new pharaoh starts to get more interested in getting out of Egypt. Like, Necho had kind of been cowed, so he wasn't really interested. But then, so this new pharaoh reaches out to Judah, to Lebanon, to Moab, to Ammon, and really tries to encourage them, like, Nebuchadnezzar's dealing with insurrections in the east. I will support you. If you rebel, that would be great, type of thing.
What was this new pharaoh's name?
I didn't write it down.
Necho the second?
No, it wasn't.
Oh, okay.
It was something that I would struggle to pronounce.
Okay. It's not in the Bible.
No.
For some reason.
And so in 589, Zedekiah refuses to pay tribute, and this is not just him, but also there's a whole, and I think there is a reference to a meeting of the kings in Jerusalem, which I forget where that was. But so Zedekiah refuses to pay tribute in 589, and Nebuchadnezzar comes storming back over, and I think it's telling that Jerusalem is the first city he goes after. Mm-hmm. And in 586, Nebuchadnezzar just flattens Jerusalem, destroys the temple, carries off Zedekiah,
and also all the riches in the temple.
Yeah, and all the
gold
temple,
and silver, the instruments and things. Along with soldiers, along with the royal court.
Yep. Yeah, and presumably, well, he did leave some of the peasants, around. But if you were a noble, you were probably getting carried off.
Yeah.
Jeremiah got left.
And then Zedekiah was cruelly treated. Zedekiah had his eyes put out, and his sons were killed in his sight.
Yeah, but right before his eyes were put out, his sons were killed. Yeah.
Right. So you could see it.
Yeah. So that'd be the last thing he saw. So then, just to finish up the timeline before we talk about other stuff, Nebuchadnezzar, after he destroys Jerusalem, kind of goes around fighting those other little countries, takes them, conquers Lebanon, Moab, Ammon by 582, and then Syria is a bigger one with the city of Tyre. That one he doesn't conquer until 572.
I believe it's pronounced Tyre.
You might be right.
Okay. But I had no idea that was in Syria. I thought that was its own separate kingdom, Tyre. Maybe I'm wrong. But that's
we can
the scripture
Yeah.
scripture seems to speak of it as its own separate kingdom.
Well, maybe we can check that later.
I thought the capital of Syria was Damascus.
Oh, you might be right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we can go back and see. I mean, I'll check it later because I'm curious. But yeah, so he takes Tyre, and then he dies in 562. And so, kind of.
How did he die? Or should we discuss that later?
No, we can discuss that. I think at that point it was old age. I mean, he was.
Okay. So how old was he?
Well, they don't really know when he was born, but at least late 60s.
Okay.
If not older, because he was campaigning for his father as like his head general for
Right.
a while, and then he reigned for 43 years. So yeah, he was like at least late 60s.
So at that time that was like today's equivalent of like your 80s or 90s, probably.
Yeah. So then, just to finish the timeline, when he dies, his son, Evil Merodach, there's a couple.
That's a fitting name.
Yeah, right. Takes over. Who actually he was not his oldest son either, which we'll get into that. And then shortly after, his grandson takes over, and then there's a usurper that takes over from him, Nabonidus, and Nabonidus is the last king of Babylon. And so he died in 562, Nebuchadnezzar did. I think it's 539 that Babylon falls to Cyrus in the Bible, and we see that.
Cyrus is the Medo-Persian king, right?
Yep. All right, so then let's see. Couple things I think that I wanted to point out, kind of doing with the Bible. Or no, also I forgot to mention a couple things that. One of the big things that Nebuchadnezzar is known for is his building.
Right.
Early on, he was more of an army guy, but then I guess afterwards he went more to building. And if you've ever heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, those are often attributed to him. Mm-hmm. There's debate over whether or not they were in Babylon. Mm-hmm. Some people think they were in Nineveh. There's not for like the 300 years after Nebuchadnezzar, nobody mentions them. Mm-hmm. It's not till later. Herodotus actually goes to Babylon 90 years after Nebuchadnezzar, and he doesn't say anything about him.
90 years
after Nebuchadnezzar's death.
After. And Herodotus was one of the most famous Greek historians, right?
Yeah, he was. A lot of people call him like the father of historians. Right. But so upon seeing Babylon, Herodotus is amazed. Like the walls of this place, I forget the. Oh man, they were crazy. It was like I think they were 90 feet tall, and like
which is 60 yards. 60.
No, that'd be 30 yards.
Yeah. 30,
and I think they were like 300 feet thick or something. But so it was.
Yeah.
And that was why when we get to the story where Cyrus takes over the city, it's so amazing. Like that when you think of Belshazzar, in partying in the
right.
as they're being sieged.
Right.
That they just didn't think it could fall.
Right.
Because they have these walls that are impregnable.
Right.
But yeah, so Nebuchadnezzar not only and he basically builds this city, and the Assyrians had recently destroyed Babylon. So when he gets there, there's not much to it. Yeah. And so by the time he dies, he has turned this into maybe arguably the most populous city in the entire world. And so if you think about the section in Daniel where he's looking out at the city and saying, what a great city, and then he is struck with madness. There's probably a bit more pride in that than just saying like, this is my city. It's more like I built this, like this is my kingdom that I built up from the ground.
Can I read that?
Yeah, go for it.
That short section real quick. In Daniel chapter 4. Starting with verse 4, it says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. I'm sorry. That's wrong. That is about his dream. Where does this talk about him,
Hold on, we'll find it. It's later in chapter 4 somewhere.
Oh, okay. After the dream thing, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, verse 30, I think it starts.
Okay, verse 30 then. The king reflected and said, "Is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty?" While the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven, saying, "To King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you," and so on. And then it talks about him being driven mad. But notice there in verse 30, it's Babylon the Great. If you are familiar with Revelation, that is a reference that Revelation uses. But anyway.
Yeah. So we can talk a little bit about his madness and his character. So as far as historically speaking, I studied into this a bit. So any secular historians will say there's no way that he was mad. We don't see anything about it, and that they would say that there's not time for it with all this stuff. But when you really dig into it, in 582 he conquered the smaller countries next to Judah, and then there's a gap till 572 when Tyre falls, and then there's another gap until 562 when he dies. And I did want to read a couple of things from Babylonian tablets. Not that I have the tablets here, I have my phone.
Well, to start, when he discussed his madness, there's a sense in which he was mad already. He was mad with pride, right?
Yeah, I think, and after studying him a little bit and then reading through Daniel again, I was less convinced that he actually converted.
Oh, okay.
And more just that he built a lot of temples. He was into worshiping the gods and into just trying to appease anything holy. And so I was more struck with it as he's going and like, oh, look at that, like these three guys didn't die in the furnace, like, must be your God's a real one.
Well, was it three? Oh yeah, it was three.
Or like when Daniel presents the dream to him and its interpretation, while he recognizes God, I didn't see anything that shows that like this is the only God, or I'm going to stop worshiping the other God.
No, obviously that's before his madness. If he was converted,
that's true. And I would say that that could be. So here I've got one of the things here. This is from, if you wanted to look it up, Babylonian tablet BM 34113. Nebuchadnezzar considered. His life appeared of no value to him. He stood and took the good road to, in the Babylonian... Sorry if it's broken up. This is just kind of how it is. Okay. And the Babylonian speaks bad counsel to evil Merodach. Then he gives an entirely different order, but he does not heed the word from his lips. The courtiers he changed but did not block. Concerning the treasure of Esagil and Babylon and securing their foundations, the cult centers the great gods they he considered. He does not show love to son and daughter. Family and clan do not exist. In his heart, towards everything that was abundant, his attention was not directed towards promoting the welfare of Babylon. With his ears alert, he went into the holy gate. He prays to the Lord of Lords. He raised his hands in supplication. He weeps bitterly to Marduk, the great gods. His prayers go forth. So that was one section. I'm going to read another one.
That's basically describing him going through a period of turmoil or something.
Yeah, at the very least.
And he's not ruling effectively.
Yeah, and also,
according to that.
So I think you can see potentially a tie to madness, not necessarily like it says he was, but also you do see a little bit of tension between him and his son.
Yeah.
Which, hold on, I've got another passage I wanted to read. So this is interesting, and this one will sound much more biblical. But this is another tablet, and this is actually
what's interesting about the one you just read is that at the end it says that he's praying to the Lord of Lords.
Yeah, so
which sounds like the God of Daniel. Sounds like
it does.
The Jewish God.
No, you're gonna like this one.
He's weeping.
So this one is attributed to Nabonidus, who is the last king. So about 15 or 20 years after Nebuchadnezzar. However, their names in the language that they originally are very similar, and actually Herodotus called them by the same name. And so it's not till like 300 years afterwards that their names are differentiated. And also, if you think, Nebuchadnezzar was pretty popular among the Babylonians, actually, and Nabonidus was not. So this may have been attributed to Nabonidus because of that.
Now, speaking of their language, did they speak mostly Aramaic? Is there a common one?
I believe so, yes. So, again, this is attributed to Nabonidus, but you're going to be struck by this. The words of the prayer which Nabonidus, king of Babylon, the great king, prayed when he was stricken with an evil disease by the decree of God in Teman. Nabonidus was stricken with an evil disease for 7 years, and from that time I was like unto a beast, and I prayed to the Most High. And as for my sin, he forgave it. A diviner, who was a Jew of the exiles, came to me and said, Recount and record these things, in order to give honor and greatness to the name of the God Most High. And thus I wrote, I was stricken with an evil disease in Teman by the decree of the Most High God. As for me, 7 years I was praying to gods of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, stone, and clay, because I was of the opinion that they were gods. And so that is not from the Bible. That is a Babylonian tablet.
Now, what's the source of that? Where'd they find that? When did they find that?
So let's see. So that was a cave in Qumran, and it's called. If you want to look up the reference of it, it's 4Q242, also known as the Prayer of Nabonidus. And so hard to read that and not be struck by how similar that is to the account of what happened to Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible.
Yeah.
And again, like I said, that is something completely separate from the Bible that the Babylonians wrote down.
Right.
And I also wanted to say, so his son, Evil Merodach, supposedly they had a poor relationship. There are other tablets documenting this, and part of the reason for this was that when the king was gone, and it doesn't say where he was, probably most secular historians would say he was off like at war. It says when the king was gone, Evil Merodach was proclaimed king. But then Nebuchadnezzar returned and imprisoned Evil Merodach. And so, again, it doesn't say where he goes. Secular historians would say that he was just off on campaign and Evil Merodach tried to usurp him probably. But if you take this into the 7 years of madness, that would make a lot of sense. That if Nebuchadnezzar was like a beast for 7 years and his son stepped up and started reigning, and then when Nebuchadnezzar came back, he wasn't too happy with him. And then there's also, I think in that same source, and I'm sorry I didn't write this one down, that when he comes back and there's tension between the two of them, that part of the tension was that Evil Merodach was accusing his father of being a bad king and desecrating the temples, which would go towards your point of potentially he being converted afterwards if he's desecrating the temples after he gets back from his stretch of madness.
Yeah. And by the way, Avil, actually, so Avil Merodach is like a Hebraic version of the Babylonian name.
I've got
it actually means man of Marduk. Merodach being the more
so I think his
Hebraic or Aramaic version of Marduk.
Babylon name was Amel Marduk.
Okay.
So
right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah.
Marduk being a Babylonian, one of the most powerful Babylonian gods.
Yeah, and their names, if you really want to get into it, all the names of the Babylonians pretty much go back to the gods.
Right.
Like Nebuchadnezzar, I think it was like the Nebu was one of their gods, and it was, I forget what it means. It might be watch something, or you're gonna look it up. Okay. So then another thing I did want to mention that I found interesting as I looked into this.
Nebuchadnezzar means Nabu, protect my heir.
That's right. So as we said, Nebuchadnezzar was a guy that liked to build. And one of the things that he got into building was he found what he believed was the site of the Tower of Babel. And now again, I have a source here that I want to read. So this is... Let me see what
Before you get into that,
go ahead.
We've reached the 29-minute mark. Let's just take a short break, and then when we get back, we'll continue on with his rebuilding of a smaller Tower of Babel. Hey, do you enjoy reading, studying the Bible, and learning how to become more like Jesus? and what the message of the Bible is all about? Well, I have a Bible study blog called Bearing Christ Crucified and Risen. Its motto is to know Christ and Him crucified. I have hundreds of Bible studies and devotional articles, as well as book reviews. And there you can also check out my book, The New Covenant Answer to Western Christianity, Recovering and Applying the Apostles' Teaching on the Church. So if you're interested in that, please head over to bearingchrist.blog. That's bearingchrist.blog to know Christ and Him crucified. And we're back talking about Nebuchadnezzar's building of basically a replica Tower of Babel, and during his reign at some point.
Yep.
And Casey's going to read from
the beer cylinder.
The beer cylinder.
Yeah.
The like beer, the
no,
drink.
like BIRS.
Oh, BIRS. So what is that? A place? I'm guessing.
It says it's a series of clay cylinders dating back to the 600 BC.
I'm guessing it's a place, probably. So it's a cylinder that recounts him building this tower.
Yeah. So this is so here. I'll read the little section here that's relevant. I am Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. My great lord has established me in strength and has urged me to repair his buildings. The Tower of Babylon I have made and finished. The Tower of Borsippa had been built by a former king. He had completed 40... Oh, okay, so there is not quite sure on what this was. One person interpreted it as he completed it 42 ages ago, but did not finish to its head. From the lapse of time, it had become ruined. The
Which
rain...
should most likely be years, right? 42 years.
No, it could be like generations or because it's old.
Oh, okay.
Where were we? The rain and wet had penetrated into the brickwork. The casing of burnt brick had bulged out. Merodach, my great lord, inclined my heart to repair the building. I did not change its site, nor did I destroy its foundation platform, but in a fortunate month, and upon an auspicious day, I undertook the rebuilding. So...
Rebuilding. So he thinks he is rebuilding it.
Yes, I mean
because he's using the site, he believes.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's still some of it left, but just that, and it does say it was burnt bricks, which is what the Bible claims. And
yeah, I forgot. How does it say that how does Genesis say that God destroyed the tower? Or does he even say? I don't think
he says he destroys it. I think he just confuses them and disperses the people.
Interesting. They're in the process of building.
And so that's what in that one
Obviously.
Nebuchadnezzar says it was not completed. And he does call it the Tower of Babylon. So it seems that he had there what he thought was the Tower of Babel, and was set to rebuild it. And supposedly he did rebuild it, but not. I mean, high for his day, but not to the height that the original builders were attempting.
But when we think of the Tower of Babel, it's not like the Tower of Pisa or like the Eiffel Tower. Or something.
No.
It is it's a ziggurat.
Yeah.
It's like
a terraced pyramid.
The Middle Eastern version of a pyramid with different levels that like steps on it.
Yeah. And actually, another little interesting thing about that is Alexander the Great, in the 320s, when he came, he made...
320s BC, right?
BC, yeah. He had conquered all the way over there, and he started living in Babylon and made that the capital of his empire. And I think he only lived there for like a year before he died, but he had the site cleared and was going to try to rebuild it again. And so we see kind of a theme is these guys that keep trying to rebuild the Tower of Babel. And that didn't go well for Alexander. He died before anything could happen.
Yeah.
Let's see. So I think as far as the historical overview, that's about what I have. We can talk
extra biblical historical overview.
Yeah. So I was gonna say we can talk about what the Bible says and about the Nebuchadnezzar's character.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, he was an ancient king of an empire. So at the very least, he saw himself as, like, a lot of them saw themselves as sons of the gods, right? As at least semi-divine.
Yeah.
Right? Basically like a demigod.
Yeah.
And that's partly why he, in the book of Daniel, he sets up a golden statue of himself that he orders all his subjects to bow down to, and Daniel's friends refused to bow down to him.
And I do want to take that right back, even to the roots of with Nimrod and Babel, is Nimrod set himself up as a god. And also at the time, if you look at the genealogies, the first generations after Noah lived longer, as the ages slowly shorten down. So you get somebody like Nimrod in that generation, the grandsons, that would have outlived his sons, his grandsons, his great-grandsons, if you do the math.
Outlived Nebuchadnezzar's
No.
sons? Oh.
I'm saying like Nimrod would have.
Oh, he would have outlived his sons?
Yes.
Oh,
because the ages are decreasing.
Right.
And so,
because he's from the pre-flood
so
world.
when these guys, with that generation, a lot of them start claiming to be gods. That they have set up these empires or these countries, and they are living beyond everybody else. And so a lot of them were set up as gods, and so it becomes kind of I would argue that that's where it starts, is if you are a ruler of an empire or a kingdom, it goes back to that of yes, I'm divine, I am a god, and worship me.
You know what one of my theories for that is, I think that a lot of that, I don't think it was simply all the time, at least, that they just came up with that. I think that they were demonically influenced, like they had like miraculous things happen that convinced them by demons that they were gods. Because I think that's what Scripture speaks of, is that the fallen angels, the devil's hordes, they went throughout the nations, deceiving the nations into worshiping these false gods, and like performing miracles to try to convince people that other gods existed, and it was actually demons, and that's what we see in the New Testament.
I forget where too I was listening in a section. Oh boy!
And that's why what would explain all these ancient accounts of miraculous things happening, such as like the alien conspiracy people say that there were aliens that set up these civilizations and like did miracles and enabled these people to do supernatural things in their building constructions and in their military campaigns. I think a lot of that was demonic activity.
One of the sections where God in the Old Testament, I'm sorry, I don't remember where it was, where God's talking about, he talks about, you want these other gods, you can have them, and he kind of just talks about them a little bit. And if you view it as demons, I think it makes more sense than just viewing them as a stone.
Right.
That I think it is recognized in the Bible that a lot of the lowercase gods that these people worship, there is demonic activity behind them, and setting them up. And actually, so this is a little bit off topic, but when I was listening to something on the Tower of Babel, there was one theory where part of their plan was to build it up high enough that they could appeal to the fallen angels and get them to come down again. Because if you think like pre-flood times,
now, they didn't consider them to be fallen angels, right?
No.
They considered them to be
gods. Gods, yeah. But if you think of pre-flood times, it seems that potentially these the fallen angels were more active. Not
potentially, but I believe they were active in a more explicit way, because we see in Genesis 6, it says the sons of God saw that the children, the daughters of men were beautiful, and they went down and made children.
Well, I say potentially because there's different interpretations of that.
Well, I think it's talking about fallen angels.
Okay.
Coming and literally having children with human.
So we'll roll with that theory then of them trying to appeal to these gods to come down. Anyway, back to Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, I think we can do just a brief overview of Daniel, what Daniel says about him, because that's our main source for his character and like the specific major events in his life. For one thing, he because he was the ruler of a vast empire with different cultures, so his policy was to assimilate those people that he conquered into the Babylonian culture. And that's what we see in Daniel, where in the beginning he brings the people of noble birth, it says, and that includes Daniel and his friends, who are, let's see here, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who most people know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they changed their names. That was one way that they were trying to change their identity.
Yeah. And Daniel's new name was it Belteshazzar?
Belteshazzar.
Yeah.
So that's how Daniel and his friends get there into Babylon. And one thing that Nebuchadnezzar was open to having foreigners serve in high official positions, because that's how Daniel and his friends get prominent. Actually, even before his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego they are condemned to the fire after they refuse to bow down to the statue. They are being used in his court as administrative officials. They're helping rule the empire, basically, as administrators. And before that, obviously, he does a indoctrination of them, and he teaches them in all the learning of the Babylonians, right? So basically all the major learning, the knowledge that they have as Babylonians, they teach it to these foreigners. Obviously, they retain their Hebrew identity because they don't give in to the idolatry of Babylon. So the first major thing that happens is the dream that he has of the statue that has different parts. Yeah. So it describes like a basic timeline of the major empires, starting with his empire and going to the Medo-Persian Empire, and then the Roman Empire.
Alexander's Empire.
Oh yeah, that's right. Alexander's Empire, and then finally the Roman Empire. And then after that, the Roman Empire is crushed by a rock from heaven, which is the God's kingdom. Basically. And so Daniel is able to... So first of all, we see a bit of Nebuchadnezzar's character in Daniel 2, where Nebuchadnezzar forces his magicians and his astrologers to come to him and tell him the dream that he's had without telling them what it is. So he's trying to get someone who's legitimate, who actually can have divine revelation, like basically read his mind and know what he himself has seen in the dream. And only Daniel.
Which a couple interesting things about that when you think about it. One, I mean, in a sense, it's very wise.
Right.
In that, I could tell whoever my dream, and they could tell me whatever they want. Right. But like, how am I supposed to know that's true? Right. And it's almost skeptical towards these mystical powers and these gods that he supposedly believed in. Yeah. And then also, I think you see a bit of his temper. Right. That he says, if none of these wise men can, we'll rip them all to pieces. And like basically, I think he says we'll tear. Unless I'm thinking of a different section. Let me see. I believe he says he's going to kill them all in one way.
Oh yeah, verse 12. Daniel 2, starting with verse 10. The Chaldeans answered the king after he asked them to to tell him the dream and the interpretation. And he said, "There is not a man on earth." The Chaldeans say this. So the Chaldeans were probably astrologers, I think, from what I've learned. There is not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean. So the reason you can distinguish the Chaldeans from the magicians and conjurers is because they're named there among the magicians and conjurers. Verse 10, 3. Yeah. In verse 11, moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult, and there is no one else who could declare it to the king except gods, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh. Because of this, the king became indignant and very furious and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. So here you see that Daniel and his friends are considered part
of the wise men, yeah.
Because they've been trained.
Yeah. And you see, like I said, Nebuchadnezzar, his two things in this. His rage, that he gets angry enough that nobody can interpret it. That
Now, to be a little fair, I mean, obviously he shouldn't have gotten angry, but the dream was troublesome because he could clearly tell that it had something to do with him.
Yeah.
Because the statue I think the statue resembled him,
Yeah.
And also it showed that his at least it showed destruction. So he knew that it was foretelling the end of this empire he had built.
Yeah.
Basically.
But you also, I think you can almost see a little bit of the instability too, of him with going into his madness. As far as, not that he's mad yet, and God struck him mad, but just in that, nobody can answer me on this dream, so I'm going to send out and have all the wise men killed. Mm-hmm. And like they look for Daniel and them. They're like, that I don't even know if Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego had anything to do with it at that time. But yeah, you're one of the wise men. You're going to get killed. Right. But then also I want to point out the Babylonian power structure. The reason I'm doing this is because it's different than the Persian power structure. Where in Babylon, if the king said, whatever the king says, it's what it is. Mm-hmm. And if he changes his mind 5 minutes from now, then that's what it is. Mm-hmm. And potentially
absolute authority. Yeah,
and potentially as a result of this, you see the Persian governing stance is different. When you think of Daniel being thrown into the lion's den, the Persian king can't recant that. He can't say, no, I'm going to change the rules. Like, no, I said that was the law, so it's the law. We have to go by it.
It's an empire of laws rather than an empire of
the Persian kings have to follow the law, whereas in this one, the Babylonians do not.
Right.
And even in general, the Babylonian Empire is a very quick burst. Like I said, Nebuchadnezzar's father was the one that started it. Nebuchadnezzar made it big. 20 years after Nebuchadnezzar's death, the empire is gone. Mm-hmm. And so this whole thing was a quick burst, not nearly as stable, not as, not a good series of laws behind it to keep it all together. Mm-hmm. Not good rulers underneath him. Right. Except for Daniel. He was pretty good.
Right.
And so then you see when Persia comes in, it's much more stable. It's a land of laws. It's got a system in place that's able to function for several hundred years.
Mm-hmm. And we know that from Scripture, the kingdom of Babylon, its purpose was to punish the Jews mainly. To punish them as divine judgment, and then to bring them into captivity over to Babylon. And they actually protected them, because then it was conquered by the Medo-Persians, and they were under their reign, and then eventually the Medo-Persians sent them back to the remnant back to Israel, or the land of Israel. So Daniel obviously tells the interpretation, the dream and the interpretation to Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar's response, like you said earlier, Casey, is verse 46 in Daniel 2. Then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did homage to Daniel, and gave orders to present to him an offering and fragrant incense. So you see there, he is very fickle, because here he's basically honoring Daniel almost like a god. He's giving an offering of fragrant incense to Daniel himself, who is perhaps his thinking is Daniel's representative of his God, so he's offering it. And he does
say right after that truly your God is a God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries.
Since you have been able to reveal this mystery. Yeah. And then his response to that is verse 48. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon. He made Daniel the ruler. Yeah. So he's serving as vice regent over Babylon itself, that province.
And it's obvious that he's very impressed.
Right. And he's the chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. He's the leader of the wise men. And so Daniel, in response, he requests that his friends also be given positions in the administration there. And then in chapter 3, we see the golden image he sets up. So it's 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. I think the cubit is roughly about a foot, right?
I think it might be closer to like a foot and a half.
Oh, okay.
But so probably
a little 75 feet or something.
Yeah,
like
less than 100 feet.
Yeah.
Which, so on the statue, first, this matches everything that you read on Nebuchadnezzar. So he was a builder. He built, especially to temples and gods and stuff. He was doing this type of stuff all the time.
Right.
So this fits with his character. And then, so just looking back.
His idolatry.
Yeah, and his idolatry. Then looking back at, again, what Chris said, he's so fickle, is that, just when Daniel said that and got promoted, he was like, your God is God of gods and King of kings, and then
he immediately goes and makes a statue.
And I don't know what immediately means. Maybe it's a few years, but
No, it doesn't say immediately.
Yeah.
It's the next thing that happens.
Yeah, in the book, as he goes and makes a statue and says if anybody doesn't bow down to it, they're dead.
Right. Yeah. If you're familiar with Daniel, Daniel is not in this story, this particular story. So it's just the three other friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They refuse to bow down, and they say if basically we will not bow down no matter what. If God decides to save us, He'll save us, and if He doesn't decide to save us, we'll just die. But either way, we're not going to bow down. So he has a huge furnace that he throws people in if they refuse. I mean, it's not really funny, but I mean, it's like over the top.
Yeah.
A blazing furnace.
Well, and then to take it a step further, when they talk to him and he gets angry that they won't, he's like, "Well, heat it up to 7 times the amount."
Right.
And like that needs to be done. Why? You know.
And as they are carrying them, or escorting them at least to the top of the furnace to throw them in, it's so hot that those Babylonian servants are killed by the heat.
Yeah.
While the 3 Jews go into it, and then Nebuchadnezzar and his officials, they see this 4th figure who looks like a son of the gods. They say
yeah.
It looks like a divine figure, and then he calls them and says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out of there and come to me. And so his response to this is Daniel 3:26. He came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their head singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. And he responded, verse 28, and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there was no other God who was able to deliver in this way. So notice he's acknowledging there are other gods still besides their God.
Yeah.
And then he says in verse 30, the king caused them, the 3 friends, to prosper in the province of Babylon. So that's that's just the second to last miraculous thing that he finds out about the Israelite God.
But reading about Nebuchadnezzar really makes you appreciate due process.
Right. And so now chapter 4 is unique because it's actually Nebuchadnezzar himself narrating the events. Yeah. Whereas before it's another narrator who's narrating them. But here in chapter 4 it starts out, Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth, may your peace abound. Now this is actually part of the reason why I think he was converted. Because Scripture gives him the opportunity to actually write Scripture, to actually speak in the first person on his own behalf.
Interesting.
And then it says in verses 2 to 3, it has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. That's also why I think he was converted. Because here's the first time that he actually calls the Jewish God the Most High God. And that's actually something you see all throughout the Old Testament. That God, the Lord, Yahweh, is called the Most High God. And then he acknowledges in verse 3 that God's kingdom is the kingdom that will last forever. Not his own kingdom, not Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, which obviously would be the natural belief that he would have. And so he has another dream that frightens him, that scares him, and then he asks the magicians again and the conjurers and the astrologers to try to relate the dream and the interpretation, but they could not. Actually, in this case, in verse 7, he relates the dream to them, rather than forcing them to relate the dream to him. And then he asks them to give the right interpretation. But finally, Daniel is the last one who does it in verse 8, and because Nebuchadnezzar recognizes in verse 9 that there was a spirit of the holy gods in you. So he recognizes that Daniel has divine power and authority to tell dreams because of the previous instance where that happened. And so Daniel relates the dream to him. It's a dream of a tree that I believe gets cut down, right?
Yep.
Or it gets cut down.
Chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth.
Right. Daniel is like apologetic to Nebuchadnezzar. He says, "Oh King, would that this dream had something to do, was to do with some other king besides you." Because obviously he knows that it's going to be a bad experience, unpleasant experience. But obviously the outcome I think was good because it convinced Nebuchadnezzar of the identity of God. So he interprets the vision, and Daniel says that you're going to go crazy and you're going to become like an animal, basically. And the object of it, God's purpose behind it, is to humble Nebuchadnezzar and to show him that he is not the ruler of all things, that it is God himself is the ruler of all things.
Well, I do want to point out too at the end in verse 27, Daniel says, "Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity." Mm-hmm. So Daniel calls him to break off his sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed. So apparently, I mean, you can say the righteousness, he was probably still worshiping several other gods.
No, he was.
And then by showing mercy to the oppressed, that he was oppressing.
Right. Yeah, at least he was not caring for the poor.
Yeah.
By the oppressed, my version, the New American Standard, translates the poor.
Yeah.
So obviously he was not caring for the poor in his kingdom. So this is a call of repentance. It's a call for God's mercy. And then so Nebuchadnezzar himself reflects that he was, like we said earlier, he was walking on the roof of his royal palace in verse 29, and he says, verse 30, "Is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty?" So obviously he thinks he's all that. He is the top dog. He is the ruler of his kingdom. And then God gives him a direct revelation in verse 31. And it says, "King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you, and you'll be driven away from mankind. Your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field. You'll be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you." So 7 periods, 7 years, will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows that on whomever he wishes. And actually, I'm going to just read until near the end, because this is pretty short, and it gives us quite a good insight into what happens here. In verse 33, "Immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle. And his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, and so his hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. But at the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me." So obviously his reason had been left from him, so he'd gone crazy. He was thinking he was an animal eating grass in the wilderness or something for 7 years apparently. And he says, "I blessed the Most High." So that means he praised the Most High, basically, and praised and honored him who lives forever. So he's recognizing that God is eternal. And then he says, "For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth. And no one can ward off his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?' At that time my reason returned to me, and my majesty and his splendor were restored to me for the glory of my kingdom. And my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out. So I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar," the last verse of chapter 4, he says, "I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven. For all his works are true, and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride." So obviously he's recognizing that he was proud. He's recognizing that and he also says, in verse 35, all the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing. So he's considering himself as nothing here. He's nothing in comparison to God. No one and God is the one with all power and authority. And he is the one who is worthy of worship. 37. I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, or lift high, and honor the King of heaven. And notice he's calling him the King of heaven. Heaven being like the sphere that is above every other sphere. So basically, God has authority and control over all things. And then he expresses the righteousness of God at the end of verse 37. For all his works are true, or literally truth. Like basically everything he does is in accordance with truth. It is sincere and it is right. And he says all his ways are just or righteous, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. So obviously, this is a pretty significant change of mind.
Yeah.
Nebuchadnezzar is having here. He's recognizing God is in control. God does what's right all the time, and that everyone on earth, all the inhabitants of earth, are nothing compared to God. So, in sum, I think Nebuchadnezzar was converted.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think too, it's really interesting to see the amount that God puts into Nebuchadnezzar. Just as far as you think of all the kings of Israel, and how often God appears to them, or you get long stretches where God doesn't. Like he'll send a prophet that says something to him.
Yeah.
Nebuchadnezzar sees the interpretation of the dream, which is a decent sign, and then
the dreams themselves are
the dreams themselves, and then the furnace. He sees one like a son of God in there, and then here he hears God's voice, actually speak to him. So that's several revelations directly from God to him, which. And just thinking why God gave Nebuchadnezzar all those revelations.
Yeah.
And part of what I was thinking was just that he is arguably the first large empire ruler of a vast area. Yeah. I mean, you have kings before, but when you think of empires building up, that's the dream here. There's 4 of them that come, and he's the first one.
Well, it's the dream before this one.
Yeah, the dream before. And so he's the first one. He's the first where God is giving it to a man to reign over. I mean, what that man might consider the earth, and not necessarily the whole thing, but not just your little kingdom and there's another kingdom over here, but like you get almost all of it.
Basically, the known worlds that was most powerful at that time.
And so, as the first man, really that gets that type of power. God consistently brings him down a notch. Says, "I am God, you are not."
A lot of notches.
Yeah, and so it does. I do think it'll be bookended too as you get to the end with Babylon. That God will again show, that I am God and you are not to the rulers of the world.
Oh, okay. I was wondering which Babylon.
Yeah, no, sorry.
You're talking about Babylon in the metaphorical sense.
Yes, okay. In the end times.
Gotcha.
But yeah, so I was just interested in again how much God put into Nebuchadnezzar and in keeping him humble, which apparently took some doing, but God is able to
making him humble.
Yeah,
and then hopefully keeping him humble until the end of his life. We don't have an account of the end in the Bible of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, but is there any historical data for how the transition of power happened to Belshazzar, his son?
Well, so Belshazzar was not his son.
Oh, okay.
To his son.
That's right. Evil Merodach.
Yeah. Supposedly there was a strained relationship. People speculate that he may have wanted to name a different heir.
So in verse 2 in Daniel 5:2, because it says Nebuchadnezzar was his father, it means basically his ancestor. Or his forefather.
Where is it?
It can also be forefather.
Yeah. So Belshazzar is actually, and so here's a little interesting thing about the book of Daniel, is that Belshazzar was one of those guys that So a lot of secular historians say that the book of Daniel wasn't written until later, because how could it be? Because it prophesies things, and instead it's just, they say it must just be telling a history. It's written way later than we think it was.
Yeah.
But there's a bunch of reasons why that's doesn't work out, and really the only reason they have for saying that is because to make it work for them that it accurately prophesies. But so one of the things was that Daniel talked about Belshazzar, and up until, I don't know, a few decades ago, nobody knew about Belshazzar, and they said this is just a case where the writer got it wrong, because they were writing it several hundred years later. They didn't know, but then recently, because Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon, but on some of the documents they found from Nabonidus, he wrote down in his own words that he had named Belshazzar as the co-regent of Babylon, and so they're like, oh, I guess Belshazzar's a real person. And just proving, and this happens over and over and over again with the Bible, where there's people groups, there's rulers, there's events that happen that secular historians say there's no evidence of this. The Bible's just making it up. But then as more evidence comes out, they say, oh, I guess the Bible was accurate about this. So honest historians look at the Bible as a great, great resource. But unfortunately, there's several that just look at it to discount it. But the book of Daniel itself, I guess what I'm doing, I'll just list a couple different things that, like it's city details of Babylon. It's the differences between the Babylonian culture and the Persian culture. The language that it uses is older than the language in like Nehemiah and Esther and Ezra.
On the language, actually, the account that's written by Nebuchadnezzar, or it's in the first person, that is actually in the original isn't in Aramaic, whereas the rest of Daniel is in Hebrew.
Yeah. And so, like, if you actually look at the text, besides the fact that the prophecies happened, everything about it says that it was written during the time of like the 600s BC, when Nebuchadnezzar reigned, when Daniel would have been alive. But there are several secular historians that will tell you that it was written in the 2nd century BC. Anyway, back to what were we talking about?
The end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and how it transitions to the next emperor or next king.
Yeah, so it goes to his son peacefully. There's speculation over whether or not that was the son he wanted, but then it goes to his grandson, and then to Nabonidus, who names Belshazzar as a co-regent. And so this is all in like 20 years, basically. All those changes happen, and so Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC. In 539 BC, Babylon's conquered, and falls to the Medo-Persian Empire. Yeah. And Daniel is still around at this point.
Yeah, you can read that in Daniel because he's under Cyrus at the end of there.
Yeah.
Okay, so wrapping up, I just say my thoughts on Nebuchadnezzar. Final thoughts. God is in control of all the political rulers or governors or what have you, of the world, and he can do whatever he wants with them, and he has control over them. Ultimately, he uses them for his purposes, and so we can pray for the salvation of them if they don't know the Lord, and we can also pray that whether or not they say that he saves them, they'll be used in order to bring justice and righteousness, like Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 says that governments exist for rewarding those who do good and punishing those who do evil.
Yeah, I would say, just want to emphasize Nebuchadnezzar's point there at the end of the section he was in, that that God is able to humble any that walk in pride.
Right.
And so just to remember that for our own lives, to remember that for other people. Not that we need to point out that they're proud, but just to remember that God is able to humble, to reach anybody. I mean, you look at Nebuchadnezzar. If God had not worked so much in his life, there's no way he reaches a man like Nebuchadnezzar. Somebody who is a pagan, who is all powerful, like is corrupted, is able to be corrupted as possible by wealth, by greed, by power, and yet God is able to humble even him.
Right.
And then also just looking at, as I study the different historical documents outside of the Bible and seeing if you come to the Bible knowing that it's true, how much they back it up. And just, it always impresses me seeing the different aspects of little historical nuggets that most historians that aren't into the Bible would just sweep aside, either think nothing of or not want them seen. And yet, when you really look for them, you see that they back the Bible up entirely, and the Bible is the best source we have.
Right, because it's God's word.
That's right.
God's infallible, inerrant, sufficient, authoritative, divine word. All right, and with that, we're going to end here. Thanks for listening to this edition of the King's Hand in History podcast. A couple of resources for you. You can go on Facebook if you're on there. We have a group called the King's Hand in History Students you can join. Also, my book that was recently published last month, or at least a few weeks ago, called The New Testament Revival of Western Christianity. You can pick up at Amazon. Until next time, pray for us and keep looking for the King's Hand in your life and proclaim his glorious deeds. Thanks for listening.